The realms of fantasy offer numerous opportunities that don't exist in any other genre, excepting perhaps science fiction. And one of these is the existence of monsters and humanoids alongside us humans, or perhaps instead of us humans. Hi, my name is Jonathan Oldenburg. I am the author of Tears from Iron, the first book in a series called Memories of the Cataclysm. It is available on Amazon and now released in audiobook, so check it out. In this video, we'll look in turn at the roles of monsters, humanoids, and humans in fantasy literature. They each have their advantages and disadvantages. We'll start with a caveat and some definitions, and then we'll move through each of them in turn. I have them all timestamped below, so you can check out just one or another if that's of interest to you. I also have included a link to my book, as well as my Substack. And of course, if you're interested in more conversations like this, please feel free to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thanks. Before we get started, I think it's important to establish a caveat. And this really should be said about anything having to do with writing or with the fantasy genre. And that is that this is an art form. And as an art form, it's all opinion-based. My opinions are based off of 40 years of reading the fantasy genre and 25 years of writing in it. But these are still opinions, and so you may have different ones, and I expect many of you do, and that's fine, that's great. So I welcome you to join in the conversation if you have any thoughts on anything I've said today, and put some in the comments below. So next, let's move on to definitions. And I think this is important because for this kind of a conversation, I suspect we all have different interpretations on what makes a monster, a humanoid, or perhaps even a human. Hopefully we agree on that, but maybe not. So anyway, by establishing some definitions, it gives us a framework from which to build the broader conversation. I suspect you'll find that the definitions I use today are similar, but perhaps slightly different from your own. So what is a monster? I define for this conversation a monster as a creature that is irredeemably evil. This may mean they are an abomination, they lack a soul, or they have some other deficiency which makes them incompatible with human or humanoid existence. They are the enemy. For humanoids, the classic definition is creatures that are human-like. For purposes of this conversation, though, I would like to add an extra layer and say that they are also not monsters. They are not evil, or at least they're not more evil than humans. And this is important. So for example, if we look at orcs, the orcs in Tolkien are monsters. They are irredeemably evil. There can be no peace made with them. They can only be fought and destroyed, or be destroyed by. In contrast, the orcs of Elder Scrolls are a civilized race, much like humans or dwarves or elves, or any of the other cultures of that world. They are human-like and not monsters. I think I should also separate out fey creatures that don't necessarily fit very well into the categories of monster or humanoid or human. And for purposes of this conversation, I find them more of a distraction. They certainly exist in many fantasy genres, usually older ones than more modern. And so you may find them to be useful if you want to add to the conversation. But for my conversation, we're going to exclude these beings. By fae, I mean creatures like fairies, sprites, and depending upon world building, it could even be elves. Fae creatures don't seem to get as much airtime these days, but they are very prevalent in older myths, legends, and some of the older fantasies. Examples include the shoemaker and the elves, or Santa's elves, the Sidhe of the Gaelic tradition, or the hidden people of Icelandic lore. And standing as counterpoint to this, if you look at Tolkien and Elder Scrolls as mentioned above, the cultures there, orcs, dwarves, elves, so on and so forth, are all much more grounded in the reality in the world as opposed to being otherworldly. Finally, humans. Hopefully this doesn't need any definition at all. They're literal humans, just like you and me. Okay, so let's get started with monsters. Why do they exist? And I don't mean this question metaphysically, I mean this question practically. Why do they exist in our stories? As an answer, I think they can serve several very important purposes. The first is what I would call a combination of wonderment and fear or rage. And that is the ancient dragon incinerating a village who has no defenses against it, or a swarm of rats viscerally bringing that fear, that cringing nausea as they swarm through a city street or over people or all sorts of horrible, ghastly things. As I said in the definitions, these monsters are irredeemably evil. They are the enemy. There can be no redemption or reconciliation with them. And that can be useful to have a foe of this kind of a variety. After all, if you make humans the enemy and then wage a war of annihilation against that group, you've essentially created protagonists who are racists committing genocide. And that's not generally a good thing to put in stories. But if you make monsters the enemy, then that moral quandary is gone. This has its shortcomings, and we'll come back to that, but it also has some value. Monsters can also fill an important role as the pests against good society, and the rats I used previously are a great example of this. They are a threat to our world, they're a threat to our way of life, or just a nuisance that has to be dealt with in a non-reconciliation sort of way. If you've ever battled rats or moles or other vermin in your own life, then you know what I mean when I talk about this. Now, the downside of monsters is that in most cases, they represent man versus nature instead of man versus man as a conflict. Now, if you're working for a man versus nature sort of aspect, that's great and it works. But just realize that monsters are more akin to the threat of a volcano erupting and engulfing a town in lava than they are to a group of humans raiding and enslaving people, for example. They are nature as opposed to man or human. The exception, of course, to this is if you have monsters who are sapient. Thinking and reasoning monsters bring us back to man versus man. But then you run into another problem that you'll have to figure out because for purposes of our definition here, monsters are irredeemably evil. If you think about dragons, now dragons fill different roles in different stories, but oftentimes dragons are sapient, irredeemably evil creatures, with Smaug from The Hobbit being an example of this. This can be done, but it adds another factor you have to consider into how you are going to incorporate a sapient, irredeemably evil group into a broader world. Why are they irredeemably evil? Why is there no reconciliation? And this can be done. I've seen it done very successfully, but you have to think about that if you're going to have that kind of a monster. Because of this challenge and the quandary and the shortcomings of non-sapient monsters, I personally find that monsters have limited usage in novels. Barring the above, they cannot in and of themselves offer the interesting challenges that you'll find in man versus man. Now, they could create challenges, for example, among a group of villagers who are dealing with a rat swarm as they interrelate with each other on how to handle the rat swarm problem. But the rat swarm itself is not creating a man versus man kind of a challenge. And that's a limiting factor. I think this separates games from novels. In fantasy games, it's often helpful to have characters who can just wade through a swarm of monsters and slaughter them with impunity. In this modern day and age, we generally don't like to be perpetrators of rampant and unfettered slaughter against sapient creatures or creatures of value. And so by having those monsters in games, we get past that. But in fantasy books, where the story is more about plot and characterization, wading through a swarm of orcs is far less valuable for the narrative process. The bigger challenge lies in those grappling of human versus human or human versus humanoid. And with that in mind, let's move on to humanoids. Remember, I define humanoids as being creatures who are human-like, but also not monstrous. They are not irredeemably evil. They have some form of civilization they can be reasoned with, and there could be war against them, there could be peace. All those opportunities are possible. Like monsters, humanoids offer the opportunity for wonderment, that exploration of things beyond our human existence. Except this time it's not necessarily tied to fear, hate, annihilation, and those kinds of aspects. Humanoids give us chances to perhaps look at sort of us, but not, in order maybe to examine our own existence more fully. And sometimes they simply can be fun. In the thematic sense, they allow us to deal with beings who are like us, but not us. And this can create a distance to remove us from perhaps the emotions of a topic or an issue. Perfect example for this would be from the original Star Trek episode, Let That Be Your Last Battlefield. I know it's sci-fi, but it fits. In that episode, we had the one guy who was black on one side and white on the other, fighting against the guy who was white on one side and black on the other. And they were locked in intergenerational genocidal warfare, absolutely hating each other, which gave a commentary on racism with less of the emotion attached to it that a normal conversation would have. And that has value. Humanoids also provide us with the opportunity to explore facets of human existence by removing parts of what we are or replacing them with something that we are not. A perfect example of this are elves, who in most stories are either very long-lived or even ageless. And this allows for the opportunity to explore what a society would be like if its members were free of the fetters of disease and aging death. This is actually one of the facets that I enjoy delving into in my own series, Memories of the Cataclysm. So what about humans? They are us, so do we really need to talk about us? I think so, because there's still some value that can be taken from inspecting the role of humans in the fantasy genre. And often that is that in a world with humanoids and with monsters, humans end up being sort of boring. We are the average against which everything else is compared. And this is natural. When you think about dwarves, for example, compared to humans, they're pretty much always shorter and stocky, and they always have beards, or almost always. And oftentimes they are associated with the greedier aspects of human nature. On the other hand, if we compare humans to elves, elves may be taller or shorter depending upon the setting, but they're pretty much always lanky, they're pretty much always beardless, and oftentimes they're perhaps more fickle than humans. So we got greedy and fickle. We got stocky and short versus lanky. So all of this becomes comparisons with the human average. Does that make us boring? Maybe. I mean, if you have these compelling dwarves who live in their mountain halls and forge iron, or you have elves in their trees singing to each other and crafting great works of magic, your halflings living in their burrows eating 20 meals a day, or your warlike visceral orcs who become a menace to society, and all those different kinds of things. Humans sort of fit a little bit into everything. There can be human craftsmen, there can be human um, woodsmen, there can be humans who love 20 meals a day, and there can be human menaces to society. So we kind of bleed into each of those other aspects of humanoids, and sometimes that ends up with us not retaining anything that is uniquely our own, and that can make humans boring. So perhaps as a solution, if it's not too late, when you look at creating your fantasy races, consider doing one of two things. Either remove humans, I know people who do that and just don't even have them, and that works, or try to make your humans not just the average. Look for ways to make them feel their own unique niche. For example, in my own stories, I have 4 sentient races, and when you look at the humans, they aren't always in the middle. They are, in fact, the shortest or tied with the shortest of all the races. I've also flipped some things on their head. For example, the elves in my world, they're called Astari, are actually created after humans. Usually in worlds, elves are the ancient people who are, who've been around and know the lore of ages. Well, while they are ageless in my world, they came after. And so that puts a different spin on that old way of doing business. Another way to do this would be to assign humans to their own distinct aspect of the world. And I've done this, and in fact, I've allowed for the races to evolve in their associations over time. For example, one of the races, who's gone through various traumas in its past, has split into 2 groups. One group is very much drawn to the open plains, the wide steppe lands, while another group has retreated to mountain fastnesses. The elves in my world, the Istari as they're called, they began drawn with great affinity to a lake, to woodlands, and to mountain retreats. But over time, many of them have become much more cosmopolitan. A third group is actually nocturnal. So they are drawn to any of the other aspects of the world, but they live at, or they are active at night. And then humans, for humans, I just went with what are humans drawn to in our world? They're drawn to rivers because rivers are the means by which travel is most easily achieved in the pre-industrial age. And so that made sense to because humans are very much your city builders and so on and so forth. So by putting them drawn to these rivers, they very naturally build the trade networks, the kingdoms, the realms, the empires that we see in our own existence. And that gives them a little different flavor, not a comparative average with the other races. So those are just some examples. There's many ways you can achieve methods of making your humans interesting as opposed to just the bland average. And I encourage you to explore those. So as a final conversation, which sort of relates and sort of doesn't to our greater monsters, humanoids, and humans, would be to look at our villains and what kind of a group does our villain fit best into? Are they best as monsters? Are they best as humanoids? Are they best as humans? You can probably already guess where I'm falling out on this conversation based upon the topics we've discussed so far. But ultimately, I would actually say that it really depends on the kind of story that you're trying to tell. In general, not surprisingly, I'd argue that your humans and your humanoids make the best villains. And this is because they're sapient thinking creatures who have complex agendas. They're not just looking for a meal or looking for a nest or, in the case of a dragon, hoarding treasure because they like to sleep on top of it. They're trying to do more complex things driven by concepts like greed or jealousy or pride, all of those ills that afflict humanity, can afflict humans and humanoids or any sapient creature, really. More than that, the best villains tend to have agendas that aren't entirely evil. There is some fragment or element that is good within the layers of bad. For example, may have a villain who wants to ensure that he has established a safe place for his people to live. That's a noble goal. I mean, it's something we all would like to have. But if he goes about doing that by eradicating anyone who lives within 1,000 miles of his homeland, that's not really a good thing at all. So it creates a villain out of what may originally have been a noble objective, and that can be interesting. Sentient villains are also capable of those smaller forms of villainy. I say smaller in the loosest sense of the word because if you've experienced any of this kind of villainy, you know it is not small. And by that I mean that which really afflicts us all and we've all endured perhaps to some degree or another, such as pride or jealousy or greed. And that can make for complex and interesting villains as well. But that doesn't mean that monsters are useless as our villains. In tales of man versus self, or man versus nature, or man versus God, the need of a sapient villain is much less present. You can have monstrous villains and achieve those kinds of thematic roles. Monsters can also serve as excellent tools for your sapient head villain. Examples would be the orcs or goblins of Tolkien. While they are villainous, they are not the head villains like Sauron or Saruman. Or in, for example, Jordan's Wheel of Time cycle, the Trollocs, while villains and monsters, really speak more to the role of the Forsaken than themselves. Ultimately, I'd argue that the important role of a villain is that he or she allows us opportunities to explore those challenges and quandaries in our own real world. Both their actions and their capacities may be fantastical, but their agendas, their driving motives are relatable. Whether they're orcs or elves or dwarves or sentient dragons, the choices they make, the problems they cause are very human. So to wrap up, let's look at the ground we've covered. We talked about monsters, specifically those kinds of creatures who are irredeemably evil, generally non-sapient. If you have sapient ones, you have a whole other challenge that you have to address, which is doable. But these are generally obstacles to our heroes or even the secondary characters who are living in a challenging world. Humanoids are the second group, which allow us the opportunity to explore some wonderment and also look at perhaps humans from a not quite human perspective. And then we have the humans who are us, and the challenge there is just trying to make us not average and boring, and looking at ways to make human interaction with the non-human species of our fantasy worlds interesting, or as some choose, not to have humans at all. And then finally, we close by looking at villains. What kind of makes the best villain for the different kinds of stories you're trying to tell? And as we said, any one of these kinds of creatures can make for a good villain. Regardless of your choice, the opportunities are boundless for engaging, awe-inspiring, or just fun storytelling. Let me know what you think below. Do you like my definitions of monsters, humanoids, and humans? Do you have any perspectives on their roles in stories and purposes they can fill? How have you solved some of these challenges? Until next time.